So that's going to start. And you will also hear when I start the recording that we are being recorded. Now you know everything that I know about today's Zoom, and we're going to be learning more. So if you are not the presenter, come with me into the dark side of things. I'll take my place behind the camera and keep monitoring the chat. Take it away, Mr. Rattner.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lori. Thank you, everyone at Mystery Writers of America for inviting me here, and thanks everybody tuning in. One little bit of housekeeping for myself, or from myself, if everybody watching would please, if you have a smartphone laying about, if you're looking at this on a laptop or desktop and you have a smartphone, or you have an iPad or tablet with a camera in it, get it in the ready. Ideally, actually, to open your camera, because a little bit of time from now, we're going to start kind of interacting. That will require you to sort of take a picture of or point your camera at the screen. So it'll all become evident when we get to that point. But meanwhile, let's jump right into it, because I got a kind of lot to cover here. I want to give you as much information as possible in the time we have. So when I began researching for my book, My Creative Space, How to Design Your Home to Stimulate Ideas and Spark Innovation, one of the first things I wanted to do, obviously, was to try to read as many books on the general subject as I could get my hands on to learn as much about what people have already learned about the subject of creative space. And what I soon discovered is that these books tended to fall into one of three categories, depending on the sort of framework through which it viewed the relationship between creativity and physical space. So the first category I would describe as books that look at space as an object of creativity, right? A kind of three-dimensional canvas on which we as people, whether as design professionals such as myself, an architect, or yourselves as do-it-yourselfers, for the most part, I imagine, exercise our imagination, right? In kind of figuring out what we want our space to be and look like and function as. The second category, I would say, looks at space as a container of creativity, a place that shelters creative pursuits, whether those pursuits are done for personal pleasure, for professional profit, or both. But the third category, the one that I ended up kind of taking as the framework through which I would write my creative space, looks at physical environment as a catalyst of creativity. So by catalyst, you all no doubt remember, by reaching back into your 11th grade chemistry class, is something that causes an event to happen without itself being affected, right? That was the definition of a catalyst in sort of context of chemistry. But in the context of today's talk, that something, of course, is going to be physical space. And the event that's going to happen that we're going to talk about or focus in on is an improvement in human creative performance. Now, this particular category is somewhat less traveled, less populated than the number of books you will find in those previous two categories. And one of the reasons for this is that it's only relatively recently that we've actually come to discover that physical space can have this effect on us. But if we look back in time, we can identify a few key milestones that got us to our present understanding. And the first one happens actually not once, but twice in the first half of the 20th century. And it takes the form of a quotation by none other than Sir Winston Churchill, of all people, who twice in his life said this: "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." So what did Sir Winston mean by this? Well, I think the first half of the quote is pretty straightforward. We shape our buildings. We, of course, are people from all walks of life, whether we're just rearranging things on our desktop to designing whole buildings or cities. So no great mystery as to what he meant there. But the second half of the quote gets a little more interesting, a little more intriguing. Afterwards, our buildings shape us. Well, how do they shape us? How do we know they're shaping us? And what are they shaping us into? Are just some of the kind of questions that this intriguing little statement brings to mind. It would be another roughly 25 years or so, but eventually science would turn its attention to answering questions just like those. And when it did so, it came in the form of a discipline known as environmental psychology. So environmental psychology is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the study of how the built or natural environments influence how we as people think, feel, and act. Call it the science of person-to-place interaction. And as I say, it gets going as a standalone scientific discipline. This would be what, late 1960s, 1970, but we're going to jump ahead one more time now to the auspicious year of 1984, when a groundbreaking experiment takes place within the field of environmental psychology that really sets the table very nicely for what I'm going to talk about today. So this experiment was the brainchild of, at the time, a young medical biologist named Roger S. Ulrich. And although he was trained as a medical biologist, his real interest was in the relationship between healthcare facilities and human well-being. So what he does is, based on actual childhood experience he had, he develops this thesis, this hypothesis, and he wants to test it, a hypothesis about that relationship. So what he does is to travel north. He was at the University of Delaware at the time of this experiment, to a town about an hour west of Philadelphia called Paoli, Pennsylvania, where there was and still is a pretty sizable hospital in operation. And obviously, with the cooperation of the hospital administrators, proceeds to undertake this experiment to test this hypothesis he has. So very often, once you've established your hypothesis, one of the first things you need to do is to gather your subjects. And of course, subjects can be animals, lab rats, those sort of creatures, but they can also, of course, be people, which is what they were in this particular experiment. That said, generally, researchers want to gather an as homogeneous a population of subjects as possible so that individual idiosyncrasies don't skew results. So everybody in Ulrich's experiment had to follow certain criteria. First of all, they all had to have been patients at the hospital. So we're talking about patients, not medical staff. They all had to have been there at roughly the same time period, and they all had to have been admitted as patients for exactly the same surgical procedure. It happened to be gallbladder surgery, if you're keeping close notes. But most importantly for our conversation today, they all had to have stayed in one particular wing of the hospital. On the second and third floor of that particular wing, they all had to have stayed in identical rooms that were arrayed along a central corridor, and all of those rooms had to be facing, therefore, or were facing, therefore, in the same direction. There was one and only one significant difference in their environments, and that was what these patients saw through the windows of these hospital rooms as they spent their several days to go through this surgical procedure and to recover from it. Roughly half the group, when they looked out into the canopies of trees that were planted just in a courtyard just outside their window, right? Remember, they're on the second and third floor, so they're perfectly positioned to be staring right into those leaves, that foliage on these trees. Whereas, let's say another half, the second half, let's say ones farther down this corridor, when they looked out, they actually had a clear shot across this courtyard and looked out onto a blank brick wall of an opposing part of the hospital, apparently the trees having been planted only to one end of the courtyard. So the question Ulrich wanted to know was, did the difference in view have any impact on patient outcomes? So he's pulling patient records, he's crunching the data, he's collating his figures, and what do you know? He finds there were indeed several striking differences between the two groups. Those that looked out onto the trees had shorter hospital stays, had fewer complications, and required less medication than those who looked out onto the blank brick wall. So let that sink in for a moment. We are talking about something outside the human body, by definition, in the environment, nonetheless altering its core physiology, altering the healing process at the level of life and death. The power of the environment to influence how we as people think, feel, and act can't get any more profound than that. So scientists have a name for what happened here. The term they give to it is brain priming. So a brain prime consists basically of three elements. There has got to be an input, right? Some kind of sensory stimulus entering human consciousness through one of the main five senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, where it then triggers some kind of output, some kind of change of condition. So in the context of Ulrich's talk, that input would be the view through the window, the change condition. The output would be an improvement in human wellness. Now, in today's talk, we're going to focus in on a kind of specific subcategory of brain primes. There are many different types. I call these design triggers, right? Because think about it. Everything about that hospital environment was the result of human agency, was done by design. I'm not using that just in its artistic sense, but in the sense of things that are done knowledgeably, intentionally, deliberately. Nothing in that environment was there by chance. Even the decision where to plant these trees, what kind of trees to plant them, et cetera, everything was decided upon. All right, so Ulrich's paper, as I said, is published in 1984. It creates quite a stir, as you can imagine, in the healthcare industry and also in the design and building fields that cater to that market. But it raises a kind of obvious, somewhat obvious, let's say, a follow-up question, which is, all right, if Ulrich were able to isolate one variable, the view through the window or the view from the hospital bed, what about all the other factors that go into making an environment? What about color, materials and finishes, artwork, lighting, furnishings? Couldn't we repeat Ulrich's basic methodology again and again and again, only in each case isolate one of these different variables one at a time to see if they have positive or, if it turns out to be negative, correlations between input and output? And that, in fact, is exactly what has happened in the, what are we up to now, 37 years since Ulrich's experiment, to the point where it's morphed into a design strategy called evidence-based design, EBD, something that folks in my industry talk and write about and put into practice quite a bit. And here you see a good example of a hospital designed with EBD in mind. There is Ulrich's tree in all its glory. Notice as well how much more glass is now provided through which to view said tree. In fact, I could walk around this room and point to maybe half a dozen different features for which I could then trace back to the scientific literature saying this is a positive element for spurring human well-being. All right, having now said all of that, having laid the table, there is a kind of obvious, again, somewhat obvious follow-up question, which is, all right, if scientists have been able to uncover all of these positive connections, correlations between physical environment and human well-being, well, couldn't we just do it all again one more time, only this time measure for improvements in human creativity? And the answer to that is, I'm happy to say yes, of course, because that's what we're doing here today. And in fact, so many of these primes, these positive correlations, have been uncovered in these nearly 40 years that I found it helpful, both in my book and in the talk tonight, to break them down into a couple of groups. We're actually going to take a sampling from each one of these groups, starting with what I call tactics. Group one, tactics meaning techniques, appearances and appurtenances. So these are all primes that stem from things that we see in a physical space, whether those things are in the fixed elements of an interior, walls, floors, ceilings, built-ins, and the like, or in the objects which reside within them, which float within them, such as furnishings, artwork, etc. And the first factor we're going to look within this category is that of color, obviously one of the most ubiquitous aspects of our surroundings. So in 2009, a couple of researchers, now these are folks from the University of British Columbia out in Canada there, they decided to look into the question of, well, does color influence how well we undertake creative tasks, creative problem solving? And very wisely, very quickly, they narrowed down the scope of their investigation to just two of the primaries, red and blue, color being a rather broad subject. And what I'd like to do with this particular experiment is walk you through it in some level of detail, so you can kind of get a sense of how data is collected in different ways among various studies and experiments. So here you can already see, of course, several differences with Ulrich's experiment. We are no longer in a hospital. We are now in a university setting. Of course, these are academics. We are no longer in a hospital room, but we are in a computer lab, which is good in the sense that now our environment is very controlled, right? Controlled conditions is what scientists like to do, which means they can minimize, they can literally control the space to make sure that as few factors will mitigate their findings as possible. We are, of course, no longer dealing with patients. We are now dealing with students at said hospital. They are, of course, a pretty homogeneous population, sort of self-selected. They're all within the same roughly age group. They tend to be in very good health. They're from similar socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds. And by the way, they are free. So researchers get to enjoy this research to the extent that is possible. The other thing, of course, you'll notice is that these folks are not lying in bed, recuperating from surgical procedure. They are on their computers. What are they doing on these computers? Well, they're taking a series of, let's call them tests, exercises, problem-solving exercises designed specifically to measure two types of thinking, sometimes called cognitive styles or mental modes of processing, known as analytical thinking and creative thinking. We tend to refer to them in everyday speech as left brain, right brain thinking, but I will generally use these two particular terms as we go forward. So what do we mean by analytical thinking? Well, here are some of the characteristics we typically associated with this type of mental processing. This is the kind of thinking where we're using reason and logic, where we're thinking in very linear, sequential steps. So, okay, I can solve for A, that allows me to solve for B and C and D and E. We're looking at things, at the problem, at the world in a very concrete detail level. Our attention tends to be very narrowly focused on something. We are often dealing with problems that have just a single solution, one right answer. So if I ask everybody out there, what's 2 + 2 equal in whole integers, I'm sure you're all going to answer 4, not because you feel it or kind of sense it. It's because you are reaching out of yourself to objective bodies of knowledge, the laws of mathematics, of course, for the answer, which would remain the answer whether we thought so or not, whether we even existed or not. And then finally, it's the kind of mental framework that looks at the world as it currently exists, in particular looking for ways to find usefulness in it in all its positive connotations. So if that's analytical left brain thinking, what do we mean by right? Well, in a lot of ways, kind of the mirror opposite. Instead of reason and logic, we tend to use our intuition, insight, and imagination. Instead of a linear sequence of actions, we tend to kind of zigzag all over the place, right? Oh, we write a paragraph. No, we scratch some words out. We go back a few steps. Oh, okay, now let me go forward, try to add some more clarity, et cetera, et cetera. We tend to look at things, certainly in the initial stage of the creative process, more abstractly, meaning more non-specifically, less concrete, less detailed, more broad brush with looking at things from a big picture perspective, right? Kind of standing back a little bit. We are often dealing with problems or tasks that have more than one right answer. In fact, don't necessarily have any right answer, but have many multiple possible solutions. We tend to look inward, and we also look at the world as it could be, right? We're looking for the novel. If it already existed, then, well, it's not novel and not creative necessarily. So what are some examples of the kind of things that people are tested or kind of exercises people use to test these cognitive styles, performance and cognitive styles? Well, proofreading, of course, is a classic example for us, right? You write something and then you kind of go back into it, or maybe you're in the editing stage or copy editing stage. What are you going to do? You're going to take your red pen out and you're going to look for all the grammatical mistakes or the punctuation mistakes or the spelling errors, drawing on the rules of grammar and punctuation and spelling. Again, objective bodies of knowledge. Memory recall would be, let's say I give you a list of 10 words and say, here, memorize them. And I take the paper away and say, now give them back to me in the same order. You know, either you got it or you don't. You're either right or you're wrong. And that doesn't mean analytical thinking isn't any less important or valuable. Obviously, for us, it is very much so. It's just a particular type of thinking to be contrasted with, say, creative assessment tests. So a classic example is what's called the alternative use test. So let's say I give you here's a brick, traditional building material. In, let's say, 2 minutes, I want you to write down all the different ways you could imagine using a brick other than as a traditional building material. Ready, set, go. So you sit there and go, okay, doorstop. Paperweight. Oh, how about walnut crusher? And on you go for 2 minutes, writing down as many possible alternative uses for this brick as possible, trying to find as many original and novel ideas as possible. Product improvement would be another one. I say, here's a broom. Hasn't changed much in about 500 years. In 2 minutes, give me all the ways you can imagine improving on this very time-honored implement of household maintenance, and off you go. So the last part of the puzzle, of course, is how are these students primed? Remember, priming is what we're really focusing in here. Well, the researchers were quite clever in how they did this. If you can imagine, these are computer monitors. What they did was to inset the test materials within the frame, the border of the monitor, and then they colorized the background, the desktop. So there was one group that looked at blue, remember, one of our colors. Another group looked at red, and then there was a third group. They looked at white. They had white backgrounds. And why white? Because white is the absence of color. So that's going to be our kind of baseline, right? Our datum from which we can measure any difference in test results between the red and the blue folks could be reasonably ascribed to the one thing that's going to be different in their environment, which is the presence of one or the other color, right? Okay, so finally, the day of the experiment arises, probably days, they had a massive number of students coming in, some 600 or so students, so no lack of data here. Some are looking at red, some are looking at blue, some are looking at white, some are taking creativity assessment tests, some are taking analytical assessment tests. They get a massive amount of data in. And what do they discover? Lo and behold, one of these two color groups did indeed outperform the other on their creativity assessment tests. And the question, of course, we all want to know is, which one was it? Okay, so this is where I would love to have everybody pick up their phones or tablet or some sort of camera that is connected to the internet. What I would like you to do is to hold it up, open your camera app, and just kind of aim at this here screen. You should see a QR code there. And by just exposing your camera to it, it'll kind of recognize it, and a little pop-up will come up to open your web browser. And if you open your web browser, I hope this is all working. If you open your web browser, you will see a question: which color group did best on the creativity assessment test, the one I just asked? And you will see three possible answers: red, blue, or don't know or don't care. And what I'd like you to do is to pick one of those. Just, hit it with your thumb, and then whatever, process it. It should go through, and I'd like everybody to do that. Now, if for any reason you don't have access to a camera, here's what you'll be able to do for this one and some upcoming Q&As, which is to go to menti.com, menti.com, as you see right at the bottom, and you will get like a window asking you for a code, and you can just type in, thumb in, whatever. This could be on a separate browser or on the same browser, 4187-7661, no break, just type those numbers in and you'll get the same questionnaire. Okay, I hope everybody's good. It's a little hard for me to communicate with folks now, but I hope everything's good, because what I want to do is to bring this on screen and we're going to see how folks answered. Okay, get anybody answering? Come on, give me some answers.
It's actually telling us that the voting has closed. I'm getting.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, no. Oh, gosh. Technology does me in every time. Bummer.
It does say, please wait or ask the presenter to open voting. So I don't know if that's something that you could do from your end.
That's so weird. Oh, well. Okay. Let's go back. Technology. All right. I'm not going to keep you in suspense. You know what you were going to answer, right? When I asked that question, red or blue or don't know. All right. Let's just go to the answer. The answer happens to be blue. The blue group outperformed the red group on their creativity assessment test, but all is not lost for you red folks. Anybody thinking red? You did have your moment in the sun. You actually outperformed on the analytical tests. Aha, the plot thickens. All right, so this is kind of useful information, right? So if you're kind of fitting out a creative space and you're kind of thinking about color, maybe you want to think about using the color blue as a kind of scheme or the basis for a scheme. Now, it doesn't mean just walls, by the way, of course. You can do floors and ceilings, but you can also have what are called neutral colors, whites, grays, blacks, against which you place blue elements, be it on furnishings, wall coverings, accessories, even artwork, window treatments, all of that can play off of neutral colors, because neutral colors have no impact on our cognitive style. All right, so as I say, this is good, useful information, but I always like to ask the question, why? Why does the human brain respond in the way it does to these kind of inputs? I mean, what's going on here, right? The more we can understand that, I think the more we can develop creative space and do our best to use the environment to further our creative pursuits. Well, of course, the moment we ask the question why, when we're dealing with psychological matters, we are necessarily having to enter into the realm of theory, right? We can't prove why people respond to blue and red the way they do in the same kind of logical certainty that we can prove that 2 + 2, yeah, does in fact equal 4 in whole integers. What it's more like when scientists and researchers kind of get into this material to try to explain what's going on here is it's more like your lawyer or attorney arguing a case before a judge and a jury. So what do you do here? You amass your evidence, you form a narrative based on that evidence that you believe will prove the case as to why this occurred, or if you're in a criminal case, why your client is guilty or not guilty. And then you open it up to the judge, the jury, or in the case of the scientific community, a fellow scientists, or in the broader sense, into the marketplace of ideas. So that's what we're going to do here. And what I'm going to do is actually show you kind of my thoughts on what is going on here. And what I'm going to do is show you a thesis statement, which I believe explains what is happening. That statement is this: our mental idea space, call it, expands and contracts in direct proportion to our perception of physical space. A famous author kind of put the same idea slightly more eloquently when she said, I like to have space to spread my mind out in. But what am I trying to get at here? And what is Ms. Wolf getting at here? Well, think about how we use language, of course. The idea of the more open, more expansive our space feels to us, the more open-minded we become, the more open to new ideas, new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at the world. The more closed in we sense our physical space to be, the more closed-minded we tend to become. Okay, so that's my basic thesis. What is some of the evidence that I can amass to try to demonstrate why I feel this is? And by the way, what does openness and space, openness of space and color have to do with each other? All right, so let's bring in my first material witness, the Mona Lisa, or maybe more specifically, Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the Mona Lisa. And what I'd like to just point your attention to quickly here is how Leonardo is using color to represent space or the lack thereof. So we can see that this canvas is more or less divided into three tiers. There's an upper third, which of course has Mona's face, but more to our point is this landscape in the background, receding far into the distance. You'll notice, of course, that that landscape is painted in a very bluish cast. There is then a middle zone, a middle strip, which is the foreground of that landscape, and that's painted in somewhat warmer tones to suggest that it's moving a little closer toward us. And then finally, the lower third, of course, dominated by her hands, the warm tones of her flesh, but more specifically, the folds on her dress are painted a deep red. So what I would suggest is that Leonardo is very specifically using color to represent space or the lack thereof. And that is, in fact, an optical truth. That is, our brains sense cool colors, blues, greens, as moving away from us, optically speaking, of course, whereas reds and warm tones visually, optically look like they're advancing toward us. So he's manipulating color to kind of go with the content of his canvas. Now, there is a scientific reason why that is all happening. It has to do with how color and light of different wavelengths get processed in our brains, none of which, of course, Leonardo would have known. But he, being a very keen observer of nature, he would have seen it, something very similar happening in nature itself. That is, you go out on a nice, bright, sunny day, and what do you see? The hills in the distance look bluish. They are in depth, whereas the foreground is warmer and more saturated by comparison. Another interesting little bit of evidence we have, actually something much closer in time, occurred in 2006 when a fellow architect named Shashi Khan ran an experiment at a trade show called the Architectural Digest show that runs here in New York City, or that's near where I am. And what she did was to set up a series of event tents, right? You have to imagine this is a trade show that's happening on the New York City pier. So this is an enormous cavern of space, and you can have all these booths and tents and little sort of structures within this cavernous space. And so she set up this event tent, or these series of event tents, and then she colorized them, one of which was blue, one of which is red, as you can see. And she went to great lengths to really preserve that sort of color experience, that chromatic experience. She had everybody coming in who came in to enjoy the food and beverage, the free food and beverage, of course, would lure them in the first place, had them wearing white hazmat suits, right, to get rid of all the coloration in their clothing. All the furnishings were white, the computers were white, the food was white or clear, I'm told. So she could just kind of have people react to pure color. And then what she did was just step back and kind of see how they behaved. And what's interesting is that the people in the blue tent, they tended to hug the perimeter, that is to move outwards, and they tended to do so in ones and twos. And that for me is a kind of physical embodiment of creative thinking, right? Which is very often a lone pursuit, or maybe with another person, a la Lennon and McCartney, or Watson and Crick, or Laurel and Hardy. And where you are very often testing boundaries, right? You're kind of pushing the creative envelope. You're doing things that have not been done before, and you are therefore to some degree, setting yourself up for possible failure. That takes a certain amount of courage and so forth. Whereas the folks in the red tent, you'll notice they kind of huddled towards the center of the space, as if the red walls were pushing them in, and they tended to do so in groups, right? Almost like groupthink versus that kind of individualism of creative mental processing. Okay, so here's a couple of pieces of evidence I would offer for my argument, but some folks there, you may be thinking, well, it's kind of interesting, Dom, but it feels a little abstract on some level. What about just kind of testing, putting people in a small space and running through their exercises, then putting them in a big space and doing the same exercises? And yes, that's basically a good idea, but it's very hard to control conditions where all factors except size can be manipulated, but there are a couple of ways to do it. One of which is just think about size in only one dimension, say the vertical, right? Because space is left to right, front to back, but it's three-dimensional. So there's also that vertical dimension. So in 2007, we've got another couple of researchers asking, okay, does ceiling height within an enclosed space affect your creativity? And they did a kind of very interesting take on this. So what they did here now is find a small room, or obviously in just a different time and place, but similar laboratory conditions in a university setting. So you see on the right an existing little lab room or lab space. It's like a one-person room. And the existing ceiling happened to have been 10 foot high. You can kind of see above the light fixture here, these hangers, right? So they're 10 feet high. There's a little built-in work surface, a little laptop. So boom, they start running students in one at a time. They take their creativity tests. Some are taking analytical tests, yada, yada, yada. They get enough people in, they get enough data going where they can take a break, and then they send in the maintenance crew, and they actually install a false ceiling, a hung ceiling out of white foam core at 8 feet above the floor. This is the same room, only now with a lower ceiling. You see the hangers are kind of gone. And then they ran a fresh group of students through, doing exactly the same test. And what do we get? It's kind of a mirror image of our blue-red. The people under the 10-foot ceiling outperformed on creativity tests. The people in the more closed in, more hunkered down space did better on the analytical test. Okay, cool. That's a great example, but then you go, well, but my ceiling is kind of 8 feet or 9 feet or whatever, and I can't exactly raise the ceiling. Someone lives above me in my apartment building, or my house is just not gonna happen. Well, there's still more ways to do this. How about if you have a window in your space, some kind of view out? Because of course, as soon as you can see beyond the walls, your sense of the openness and expansiveness is almost invariably going to increase exponentially. And here's some great examples of writers working in spaces where there is that outlet. You don't necessarily have to be facing through the opening, facing through the windows. In fact, you can see in the left and right here, in fact, all of them. And there are even some reasons why you might not want to. We can get to that later. But now you say, well, I've got to, I lived in apartments for many years in New York City, so I know what space constrictions can be like. You might have your work surface in a recess and an alcove where there just isn't an opening and the ceiling isn't 10 feet tall and all of these other things. Fret not, we've got more techniques up our sleeves. We could use artwork, right? Because here's a key thing about primes. They don't always have to be literal. That is, our brains will respond to representational and metaphorical renditions of some of these primes just as well as they would to the real thing. So if you happen to have some of these wonderful vintage 1920s, 1930s travel posters with these beautiful depictions of deep landscapes, well, they've done studies where, yep, that will kind of trigger the same kind of reactions as literally looking out onto these wonderful actual views. But wait, there's more. And this one you'll particularly, I think, as writers be interested in. There's something called textual distancing, right? Because words alone can prime human thinking. So if you happen to be sitting in California or here in New York and you see a poster and there's that word Greece or Scotland or the Italian Riviera, believe it or not, those words alone, by dint of the fact that we are thousands of miles away from these places, can move you into one cognitive style or another, in this case, into that right brain thinking. In fact, one of the most famous experiments in environmental psychology involved words, pure words. They had subjects doing word puzzles, classic example of creative assessment exercise. And what they did was to take one group and nest or seed or embed certain words that had associations with elderliness, with older age, such as Florida, bingo, gray, stuff, just old. And they just kind of sprinkled them in amongst these other sort of more neutral terms. And they ran these folks through their battery of tests. And then they brought in a fresh group and they gave them more neutral, age neutral, none of this Florida bingo stuff, but similar, very similar puzzles. And they had them run through it. And here's the fascinating part. It almost in some ways had nothing to do with the test results themselves. What they did was to time how long it took for people to walk from their testing station to the elevator in the building as they were leaving. And what they discovered was that the people whose puzzles had been sprinkled with words connoting old age walked more slowly than those who did not, regardless of their actual age. So your words are powerful. They can change the way we think, feel, and act. And then last, within this same tactic or technique, we have something called temporal distancing, which is time. Of course, we're now measuring distance, not just in feet and inches, not in terms of age, but in terms of actual time. So the fact that these are from the 1920s and 30s actually have been shown to change our mindset. A good example of this would be if you have family photos of your kids or yourself as children kind of sprinkled around your workspace, just evoking these days gone by, this kind of temporal gap can shift our thinking. And actually one more, which you might find of interest in the distancing, among the distancing prime, is actually what we're wearing. Can change our mindset. So there is a theory that there's something called social distancing. That is, the more finely, the more formally we get dressed up, the greater that sort of psychological distance between us and, say, someone just kind of in casual clothing, or even within our own selves, right? You know, when you get dressed up for a big night out or a fancy event or something like this, and you put on the tux or the long gown or something really formal, you do not feel a sense of elevation in terms of its comparison, say, to everyday life. And I'm not saying you have to be like Tom Wolfe, where you get dressed up in a white suit and a hat to get to work, but it is actually something to think about. What you're wearing can, as I say, change your behavior. So with all of these different ways of distancing our mental mindset, you would think that some researchers out there would kind of try to get their arms around this. And in fact, they have, with a sort of overarching theory. It's called construal level theory, not my favorite, kind of a tongue twister of a name. But the basic idea of construal level theory is that the farther away we construe something, whether it is an object, an event, a person, the more right brain, the more creative our mindset tends to be. Whereas the closer we view those things, the more analytical we tend to be. And the way I like to kind of visualize this is to imagine yourself flying over mid-country, mid-US, and you look down, you're over farm country, say Nebraska, all these great plains, and it's very flat, and you're at 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet. You look down, what does it look like to you? It looks like an abstract painting, right? Because your eye is too far away to discern detail. The information is not being fed into the brain. So all you see are broad patches of color and light and texture. You don't really kind of know what you're seeing in real terms. Whereas if you parachute it out, well, look, I can read the lettering on the tractor now, and I can see every ding and nick in the sides of the tractor, and I know what's being grown. It's much more detailed, obviously, much more concrete what you're seeing now, all of which, of course, should remind you of those characteristics we looked at just a few minutes ago. On the right, literally the big picture view of the world; on the left, a more concrete, detailed one. All right, so I did have another polling question, but it sounds like my polling people have gone home to sleep. It's early evening here, folks. Bear with me on that. But I would like to switch gears into another subject area altogether, which is furnishings. And we're going to look at a couple of different aspects of it here, starting with posture. How does a different furniture that we use in our writing space, in our creative space, influence our mental states? So we have all, I think, or many of us, I imagine, have heard the term sitting is the new smoking. And I would say, you know, it's a little hyperbolic, that statement. No, if you sit, you're not going to necessarily get cancer, you know, the next week or the next month. But there is some point to it, which is to say that prolonged periods of sitting generally doesn't help us health-wise, psychologically as well. So one of the big, of course, recourses that has become somewhat in vogue in recent years is to get yourself a standing desk or to be able to stand while you write. In fact, standing desks go back to the Middle Ages, believe it or not, and more recently, even still back to the 1950s. This is probably, I guess, 1950s, early 1960s. There's Ernest Hemingway standing at his standing desk. They've been around for a while, but they've become more popular as we have begun to appreciate that sitting for prolonged periods of time is not necessarily a good thing. However, that being said, while it is absolutely good health from a health perspective, the jury is still out as to whether it aids us from our creativity in terms of our creative performance. However, there is one posture that they have definitively linked to improve creativity, and that is to lie or recline while you're engaged in creative activity. And this particular setup here belongs to Michael Chabon, the novelist. And you can see what he's doing here. He's using a lounger for his work, primary seating piece of furniture while he's working. He's got a little, what is that, a little stand there for his laptop, I guess, and a little side table for knickknacks. And that's how he writes. And many others, as you can see in the lower left, have used this posture as well. So, okay, cool, that's good. Again, we ask sort of like, why? Why is this happening? Well, here we get to take advantage of modern technology, brain scanning, neuroimaging, all that good stuff, where we can now peer into the human brain in ways that we could not do 20, 30 years ago. And what they have found is that when we are lying down, a little piece of our brain called the locus coeruleus, little red guy here, locus coeruleus literally means the blue place, because I guess the thing itself is blue, even though in the picture everything but it is blue. But more to the point is the function of locus coeruleus is to secrete a substance called noradrenaline or norepinephrine. They mean the same thing. And so apparently what happens is when we are springing into action or we need to be made alert, something has caught our attention, particularly if we sense any kind of self-harm coming our way or threat coming our way, the locus coeruleus pumps this substance, of course, adrenaline, of course, you can sense what it's doing. It's making us energized, much more focused, much more alert. Whereas when we lie down, we are signaling to our brain, we have no immediate need to spring into action. We feel safe in our environment. So the locus coeruleus deactivates, that substance starts turning off. And generally speaking, the more relaxed we are, the more safe we feel, the more chill we are, the more creative we tend to be, right? Because again, creativity to some degree is an act of courage, right? It takes a certain willingness to test the waters, to do new things, and we'll only do that if we feel relaxed and safe and so forth. Now, when it comes to posture, I think the most important takeaway is not even so much which one of these particular postures you might adopt while you're doing your writing, as it is the idea that you are perhaps best served by alternating your posture through your writing sessions. Certainly anything, past 30 minutes. And the class example here comes through us, courtesy of Vladimir Nabokov, famous author, of course, of Lolita, and his afternoon work regimen would start with him standing on the left there at his standing desk, and he would do a certain amount of writing. By mid-afternoon, he is seated at his desk, and by early evening, he is sprawled out on his bed, doing the last of his creative work. And you'll notice, of course, the clothes are sort of deformalizing because he's getting more relaxed as he goes through the day, and that's all very good. So here you see him alternating his posture. That's the key thing I think you all want to try to keep in mind, even if it's just two of the three, like you have a seat at a desk and then you have an apparatus or your desk lifts. There are such tables out there, the hydraulic lifts, that you stand up, then you sit down, then you stand up, sit down, or you do all three, or whatever you do. Think about trying to shift your body. It's better for your health. You avoid lumbar and muscle problems, and presumably it's going to be better for your creativity as well. Another aspect of furnishings, one that you might not think about, is their shape. Does the shape of furniture impact our cognitive style? Well, apparently it does, because we have actual studies which shows that furnishings, which are predominantly curvilinear, circular, rounded in detail and silhouette, actually promote creativity, whereas those that are much more dominated by straight lines, continuous edges, corners, and so forth seem to move us into an analytical mental framework. Okay, what's happening here? Again, I have a little visual analogy. Think about yourself maybe this morning or tomorrow when you sit down at the breakfast table and you pour yourself a bowl of cereal or berries or nuts or whatever it is, and you're ladling that food. What are you doing? You have a spoon in your hand and you're sticking that spoon right into a vulnerable body cavity, your mouth. Are you thinking twice about that? No, of course not. You're talking with a family member, you're thinking about the day's events, you're reading the news, whatever it is. Whereas if you were to get up and walk over to your counter and maybe pick up a grapefruit and want to cut it in half to be able to eat it, you pick up a sharp kitchen knife. Think about your mindset now. You are super focused on that knife, are you not? Because it is coming into very close proximity to the fleshy tips of your fingers as you hold that grapefruit in place and slice through with your knife. So a very different mental mindset depending on which shape you're trying to interact with. And here we see that correlation again between mood, mindset, what the scientists like to call affect, and cognitive style. The more safe, laid back, mind wandering, all of these kind of positive mood connotations we find ourselves in, such as when we're eating cereal for breakfast, we're happy, we tend to be more creative. Whereas the moment that threat of self-harm comes into play, we tend to move into an analytical framework. We become slightly more stressed depending on the level of threat perception. But as soon as we do that, we want to become more analytical because we need analytical cognition to keep us out of trouble, right? We want to be focused. We want to be alert. We want to be attentive. We don't want to be mind wandering and looking off into the distance while we're placing this very sharp knife in close proximity to our person. So an easy mnemonic here: fear fosters focus. The moment we feel threatened, the moment we feel afraid on whatever level, subliminal or overt, we tend to become more focused, whereas the opposite becomes true as well. Here again, we have some interesting data from neuroimaging. This time we are dealing with a piece of the brain called the amygdala, right? And what is significant about the amygdala is it is the fear processing center of our brain. And this is where we get the key to, okay, I understand when we're like sticking a spoon in our mouth, we're not too worried about hurting ourselves versus say a knife, but let's go back to that furniture that we started with. Like, nobody's ever sliced and diced themselves on a straight backed settee or sofa. So why should that instill this sense of threat and so forth? Well, that's where the amygdala comes through, because the amygdala goes back to our earliest days, back on the African savannah, right? This is something that's evolved over millions of years, and that amygdala was there to help us survive by signaling when it sensed danger. So think about nature. There are not too many straight lines and pointy things in the natural landscape when we're running around the African savannah, but those that do exist, they tended to hurt us. So over time, the amygdala was able to decode the environment, to look out for straight lines and pointy things and signal danger, danger, danger to us. And it still does so, because as we'll talk about in a moment, evolution moves just too slowly for it to catch up to the fact that a sofa is not going to hurt us, whereas animal fangs will. We'll talk about that again in a moment. And then the last thing within furnishings I want to just point out here is something called orientation, right? Which is how furniture orients to us to our surrounding space. And here, of course, we see a classic example, which is to place our desk against a wall. The problem, there's actually a couple of problems here, has to do with its orientation. And it also has to do with a little bit of that compression of space I talked about earlier, right? Because now your head is 20 inches or so from the wall, so you don't have that sense of openness or expansiveness. We'll talk about ways to mitigate that at the end of the talk. But for now, what we're dealing with is a theory called prospect refuge. So this is developed in the mid-1970s by a British geographer named J. Appleton. He wrote a book called The Experience of Landscape, where what he did was to sort of canvas, pardon the pun, 18th, 19th century landscape paintings. And what he noticed was a certain pattern in the way the figures within these landscapes were oriented relative to the surrounding landscape, from which he developed this psychological theory called prospect refuge. And what he determined was, by seeing so many of these paintings where the figures, here they are here, are perched at the edge of a space, right? They're sort of looking out over this enormous landscape receding into the distance. They have what he would call maximum prospect, right? They can see almost 180 degrees to the left and right, everything that is in front of them, but people can't see. We don't have eyes in the back of our heads. So for sense of protection, we need to be at the edge of a landscape, and we need some like protection behind us in our blind spots, and even above us. You can just see a little branch sticking out over their heads. That is the refuge component. What he proposed is that we seek out habitats, positions in space that balance these two needs. Yes, we want to be able to see everything in front of us, but where we can't see, we want protection. And so that's one reason, at least, why people really, we all salivate off for that mountain house or that mountain perch, where we can look out onto the landscape and see everything in front of us, that enormous amount of prospect, but we have that sense of protection. We're up on a slope. We've got rocks and trees protecting us to the sides behind us so that we can't be attacked by hostile forces. Now, again, think back to that African savanna. This would all be relevant when we were trying to survive eons and eons ago. But of course, today we're generally not threatened in our own homes or workspaces. And yet, because of the slowness of evolution, people still become anxious when they don't balance prospect and refuge. And so turning your back to the space behind you by placing your desk against the wall could possibly be changing how you think, behave, and act. So what do we do if we have the option is to turn that desk around to face our space? Because look what happens now. We can see everything in the room. We've got bookcases, walls behind us in our blind spots. We've got a ceiling above us. We even have the extra benefit of having the window. We can even see anybody approaching the space from without. Now we have that ideal kind of orientation to our space. All right, let's keep going here. So I've been talking about the African savanna a lot and evolution and so forth. So in fact, we have wandered into kind of a sub-discipline to environmental psychology, which is called evolutionary psychology. And that's the study of how our evolution as humans did continue to impact us today. And as I said, our whole genetic profile, it's very much rooted in nature because we evolved for 4 or 5 million years. It's only in the last flick of an eye, however, that we've kind of gone 180 degrees in the opposite direction, right? We now spend 90% of our time indoors and very often environments where nature is in scant supply. So what is going to happen here is that as a result, we're not getting the kind of mental and physical nourishment that we used to. And they have pegged this kind of depletion of nature-based inputs to all sorts of things, health-wise, anxiety, irritation, sleeplessness, even cancers have been linked to it. And not surprisingly, of course, our creativity can diminish as well. So what do we do about this? Well, the remedy that has been proposed comes under the rubric of something called biophilic design. Biophilia is a word that means love of nature. And the idea of biophilic design is we're going to try to reincorporate nature as much as possible into our physical space, because we know we're not going back to living in caves and trees, but we can restore something of the equilibrium between the two by very consciously and deliberately trying to bring the two together more than would otherwise be the case. So one obvious way, of course, is if you have a view out onto natural terrain, you can enjoy that view and the nature-based inputs that come from it. In certain climates, more on your side of the country than mine, you can maybe even get rid of the wall altogether between inside and outside and really have a continuity of nature and interior space. Even in enclosed space, we can literally bring nature in. Simple desk plants who can have an enormous effect on our mental state. And that would include pets, animal life, of course, as well. Another technique would be to utilize nature-based materials. Brick, of course, is made from the mud of the earth, from clay, wood flooring, wood finish desktop. All of these things signal to the brain that nature is present and it's sensing that presence of organic growth, which is what we want to experience. Color, we already saw that a little bit in blue. Of course, blue sky, blue waters, but the second color that has been positively linked to creativity is, of course, green, for reasons that are pretty self-evident. And then I should also mention, well, somewhere around 80% of our information is channeled through the sense of sight. We should not neglect the other senses, such as sound, right? The sound of running water would evoke that sort of primordial landscape of waterfalls and lakes and so forth. And, it may feel a little woo-hoo, but, this is real stuff here. This is real data. They have measured anywhere from 15 to 30% improvement in creative performance in biophilically designed environments. All right, let's jump We're going to kind of run through the last bunch here. We're going to jump to group 2, which I call the ambience tactics. So these are primes that are a little more diffuse, a little less tangible than the ones we've been looking at in group 1. So we're just going to look at a couple here, starting with lighting. How bright or dim should a creative space be for maximum peak creativity? Well, the measurement that our research friends have come up with is 150 lux. So just to give you a point of comparison, several points of comparison, 150 lux is very dim because reading minimum considered to be 300 lux. Your typical office, remember those office spaces, about probably 500 to 700 lux. Supermarkets, very bright, 1,000 lux. We go outside, even on a cloudy day, we're in another order of magnitude, maybe as much as 10,000 lux, up to 100,000 lux on a bright and sunny day. So 150, well, that's like next door to dim. What could possibly be going on here? Well, there are several theories, but one of which I think you can kind of get a sense of from this image here. Think about how our mind changes when we see something under bright light versus that very same object under dim light. When it's under bright light, what happens? First of all, our eye, everybody's eye probably went right to it. That's just a natural human response to go to the brighter lit things. And we started like zooming in on all these details, these little cogs and screws and bolts and nuts. And we saw everything very clear and defined and delineated. And we're kind of outside ourselves in the sense that we're focused on this object versus, say, in the dimly lit side of things. Well, you can't really make things out. You don't have anything to really latch onto. You don't know quite what you're looking at. Feels much more what? Abstract, non-specific, all of which one more time brings us back to our sort of yin-yang dichotomy of analytical versus creative thinking. Now, again, kind of useful information, but we all know it's hard to do our work when we can't see what we're doing, especially if we're writing by hand or something of that side. So there are specific places, I would say, in the creative process where this can really come into play. One of which is when you're starting a project and you just want to kind of brainstorm. Think about maybe just getting into a low light space, dimming the lights, and just letting the mind go where it goes. The other place that this can be useful is if you hit a creative impasse and you just need to kind of step away from a problem, again, kind of get yourself into a low light space, and the mind tends to open up quite nicely in that case. All right, let's just jump forward to sound. That's another tactic that would be in kind of the ambient groups. What's the ideal sound level? Think about it for yourselves. How many folks, you don't have to answer, like pure quiet, no sound? How many folks like to work in, say, coffee shops, right? Or at the beach where there's a kind of crashing waves, or there's chit chatter and glasses tinkling and all that kind of background noise, which creatives seem to do since you find them in your local Starbucks or coffee shop to quite a degree. Well, this latter conditions, that there is a certain amount of sound, actually is where science has kind of come down and identified a sort of peak or ideal scenario, which is that 70 decibels seems to be a kind of sweet spot as far as noise goes. Now, there is a caveat here, a couple of caveats. First of all, the noise wants to be white noise, right? Unintelligible sound, background chatter. If you sit next to somebody, we all know this, who's talking on a phone in an office and you're hearing one side of the conversation, drives us crazy, right? We just can't focus on anything. So it has to be chit chatter or ocean waves or rain or crickets, something of that sort. The other thing is, if you do like quiet, that's perfectly okay too. And I should make this point about all the scientific research. We're looking at hundreds of subjects being tested because we're trying to find the human archetype, the human average. Whereas when it comes down to you or me or the next person, your personal, of course, persona, constitution, preferences have to come into play. And so if it doesn't accord with some of these figures, don't worry about it. On the other hand, you might try some of these other things to see, in fact, if you respond even better under these altered circumstances. So there's, yes, you're hearing a little bit of white noise there. Thank you. Okay. And then the last group we'll just touch on, I call the action tactics, because these are things that people do that have been found to boost creativity. And of course, if you know what they are, you will hopefully engage in them that much more, or fit out your space to allow you to engage in them. Let's just run through them on the left. Starting on the left, of course, is reading, something near and dear to us, both nonfiction as a way to build our knowledge base, but also, of course, fiction. And what's particularly great about reading other people's fiction is that it puts your mind into the characters that are not yourselves, right? That's one of the hardest things we have to do as creatives, which is to get out of the same old perspective on the world and try to assume the identity of people who are not ourselves. Taking a walk, of course, doing yoga and meditation, all of these have been scientifically linked to improve creativity. Making things, preferably by hand, exercising, sleeping and napping. Classic, of course, taking baths and showers, looking at a fire, or again, believe it or not, a YouTube video of a fire, playing, cooking, eating certain foods, drinking certain drinks, listening to or playing music, drawing, sketching, doodling, journaling, which I'm sure many, if not all of you do, hanging out with our pet, engaging in hobbies and things we just do for fun and pleasure, and yes, even doing laundry. So a couple of things about these particular actions you may have noticed. First of all, nearly all of them are very closely associated with domestic life, which is one of the reasons why, statistically speaking, we get more ideas at home than in any other single environment. The other thing you'll notice about them is that they almost all have pretty much nothing to do with creativity, or very little. I mean, come on, like doing laundry, that's the last thing we would all think of as a creative pursuit, which leads to one of the paradoxes of creativity, which is that if you want to come up with good ideas, one of the best ways to do so is to stop trying to have them, to engage in what's called the incubation period, where you step away from a problem and go off and do something else. And in some ways, the more mindless, the better, or at least the more pleasurable, the better. And here again, a little visual analogy I like to use is that of a seesaw. So first of all, think of seesaw, this particular diagram, as thinking, right? So first thing is, of course, we have finite mental processing powers, just as seesaws have a finite length. And the other thing about seesaws is that they go up and down, and so too does our brain oscillate back and forth between those kind of two cognitive styles. So for the purpose of our diagram, let's think of the left as conscious thinking, the right is unconscious thinking, the left is analytical thinking, the right is creative thinking, the left is focused thinking, the right is defocused, all the same thing. What happens depending on what we're doing is that one or the other side of this seesaw is going to go up and down. So for example, let's say you're at home and you're doing your taxes, right? It's that time of year, you are crunching numbers. What's going to happen is that the conscious end of your mental bandwidth is going to go way, way up, because you really want to be focused on what you're doing. You don't want to screw up your taxes and pay more than you have to, and you don't want to be arrested by paying less than you have to. So you are super focused, which means that your unconscious creative side of mind is kind of shunted off in the background. You don't want to get too creative with your taxes. You can get in trouble doing that. Whereas, let's say we're in that shower or bath. Now what's going to happen is kind of the opposite, of course, is that our conscious, analytical, focused thinking is going to go way down. Why? Because we've all taken showers 10,000 times before. We don't have to think about what we're doing. We're on automatic pilot. It's habitual, reflexive behavior, which means that all that executive functioning, all of that front lobe, very conscious thinking and self-management and self-direction, they can kind of tone it down, which opens the floodgates to our back of mind, which is where all these little bits of information and ideas and random thoughts are sitting, nesting, because they have to. They'd explode our brain if we thought about them every day. But once those doors open, they can start bubbling to the surface. They can start colliding and engaging with each other and coming into consciousness, right? Because creativity to a large degree is happening very often at or even below the level of consciousness. But here we get a kind of a view into it that we don't get in everyday circumstances necessarily. And that's why, of course, we're standing in the shower and boom, out pops a great idea. I want to just touch very quickly on one particular tactic within the action groups that I mentioned, which is drawing. So as I say, I imagine a lot of folks here, journal or keep track of ideas as they pop into their head. I would like to throw out the possibility of, in a sense, amplifying that practice to at a larger scale, right? By turning your walls into writable surfaces by using things like whiteboard paint, as you see on the right, or whiteboards, which you can actually purchase and hang on your wall, as you see on the left, because you get a lot out of this as a complement to your journals, right? Journals are very private and intimate and small scale, and they're great because they're portable. You can take them with you, but in your workspace, you could kind of as I say, supplement that or pair that with this large scale drawing surface, because now you're not hemmed in by space. You might have an entire wall to draw on. So you can do all the good things that journaling does, such as idea capture. Of course, that's very important. And getting those ideas out of your head, externalization, as I call it here, all very important, but you can develop them at a scale that you can't necessarily in a small journal. And best of all is you can collaborate with other people, right? Because you're putting it in kind of a public place where someone could come by and say, oh, that's an interesting idea. I should talk to so-and-so, or you can engage others with your thinking in a way that's much harder to do with a journal. All right, last thing. We're going to run through a case study here. I know we're getting kind of late in time, so let me just run through this. Here we see a very nice little writing space. I just want to show you kind of how this is in many ways reflective of the things we've talked about today. So, you know, with all spaces, there's no perfect space out there. Everybody has constraints, even people with like zillions and zillions of dollars. So let's just talk quickly here, identify those constraints. Orientation, we talked about not necessarily wanting your back to the space. We don't have a view to speak of. We're in this blind alcove. The size, kind of small. It looks like a converted closet. And yes, even the budget, you know, it's not infinite. Yes, that's a very nice professional looking paint job and trim, but you know what, I could see that the money was kind of running out by the time we got to the chair, because that's looking a little more sort of IKEA. Nothing wrong with that. We love IKEA for making design affordable, but it means that the budget wasn't infinite. So what has this person done to kind of mitigate some of those constraints, some of those challenges? Well, we talked about the color blue for the back walls. We talked about artwork, and in particular artwork having to do with biophilia, nature, in addition to things like potted flowers or flower arrangements, both real and artificial, I should point out, which also brings, of course, up the another sense that we can activate, which is scent. There have been a few scents that have been linked to improve creativity. I believe cinnamon vanilla is one of them, but scents in general tends to lift mood and therefore creativity. Of course, reading. We don't even need to get into that. Visual complexity, we didn't talk about that much, but it's very important that the space not feel like empty and void, that there be something that engages the eye, because when the eye has something to engage in, it's going to start moving around, right? So when we look left, what's called saccadic movements, what happens is our right brain activates. When we look to the right, our left brain activates by looking back and forth, by having something to engage the eye, jumping around. We're actually forging the two halves of our brains together, which makes for holistic thinking, whole brain thinking. We need both, right? We need to edit, we need to proofread, we need to get things right just as much as we need to create them in the first place. So it is important to develop both sides of the brain equally. Beauty has been linked to improved creativity. Generally, any creativity begets more creativity. So that kind of makes sense. And of course, routinization of space, meaning you come to the same place again and again and again. Remember Pavlov's dogs? He rings the bell every time the dogs come to eat, to the point where all he has to do is ring the bell and the dog starts salivating. Same thing with space and mindset. If you come to the same place again and again, you will enter into that creative mindset by designating this as your creative space. And of course, time has the same effect. Try to keep to the same schedule as much as possible. It all feeds into our mental state. All right, finally, if you are interested in learning more about the things I've talked about today, there is my book, My Creative Space. In addition to the ones we touched on today, there's probably another 40 techniques which I describe in that space. And this time, I think that QR code will work if you want to order a copy, because it is supposed to take you right to that, you know what, webpage where this book can be ordered. I would also, of course, point out my website, donaldrattner.com, in particular resources page. I got other books listed, podcasts, seminars, all things to do with creativity in general and creative space in particular. And with that, I thank you all for listening. Oh, thank you very much. All right, all done. Laurie, over to you.
Thanks. So I have been monitoring, I'm going to pop back in here. I've been monitoring Facebook and I don't have any questions there. And I think everyone was with rapt attention here. So we have not a lot, we have several comments, but no questions. So if anyone else has a question right now, please put it into the chat. And if I could, I'm going to go ahead and stop pushing to Facebook now. So we're going to stop.